Hi, this is Mark Galeotti, the Institute of International Relations, Prague, with another short little video thought on Russian politics. So yesterday, on the 12th of June, Russia Day 2017, we saw also a whole series of protests called by opposition leader Alexei Navalny and his anti-corruption foundation. I must say, I think that Navalny may have made a slight tactical mistake by actually moving his Moscow protest into the sort of central street Tverskaya at the time when there were also historical reenactments going on. I can't help but feel that a lot of ordinary Muscovites might well actually be rather peeved by this intrusion. But even so, we saw a nationwide series of protests. At the very least, Navalny has managed to maintain a degree of momentum. He may not have advanced his case further, but certainly nor has he been defeated. So at worst, he's still, as it were, in the game, even though he himself is out of the game for 30 days, having been just imprisoned for yet another sort of a breach procedure. What's interesting to me, in some ways, was the decision to say, well, what we want our protesters to do is to carry with them the Russian flag. Now, in part, that's a tactical move. A sign of protest, on the other hand, also looks patriotic, and presumably then also looks bad when the police and the so-called cosmonauts, the riot cops in their all body armour, roll in. But I think it was more than just a tactical move. In many ways, I think Navalny is very cleverly framing this as an essentially nationalist struggle, a struggle to save the soul of Russia. Because after all, this is where Navalny is. I mean, I think he is genuinely a patriot with just the right dash of racism to really be able to appeal to the Russian sort of popular culture. And so in this way, he's actually moving the struggle onto what kind of Russia should it be? What kind of Russia would you Russians like to have? And I think that's actually potentially a very powerful message, not least because he's not the only one who's moving the battle this way. If we look at the further right, because Navalny is, I would say, sort of liberal right, but if we look at the more extreme right, you have figures like the sort of Girkin, Strelkov, the commander of forces for a while in Crimea and the Donbass, but more to the point, some rather more intellectually heavyweight figures like Konstantin Krylov, who very much frame their nationalist campaign in terms of Russian nationalism and in many ways saving Russia from the real threat, which is not NATO. It is not Islamic State, but it is the Kremlin and its cronies around it. It's quite interesting to see how there is this particular vein within Russian nationalism. Not the showy figures like Dugin and Prokhanov, who one sometimes hears mentioned as the sort of philosophers of the Kremlin. They're not. They just purely mobilize when it's handy to have a lunatic right-wing voice. But rather a more thoughtful and in many ways more dangerous nationalism critique of the Kremlin that says, by your embezzlement, by your theft, by your hollowing out of state institutions, by your destruction of the rule of law, you actually are not being patriots, quite the opposite. You are threats to Russia. So that's an interesting alternative way. So we also have the nationalists trying to compete for the true patriots card. And perversely enough, we also have the communists. Now, admittedly, when I say the communists, I don't mean Zyuganov and his essentially brain-dead and entirely supine leadership. I'm talking about the sort of the rising generation of leaders, for whom, yes, on the one hand, they still mobilize this mythologized Soviet nostalgia for a Soviet Union that never ever was. But that actually can be quite powerful. And in a way, what's interesting again is the extent to which that is being mobilized as a patriotic thing. It is not just the Soviet Union. No one's saying let's take back the Baltic states or anything like that. Not seriously. But instead, they're talking about aspects of the Soviet state. A time when, especially in these mythologized narratives that they use, public services genuinely were public. A time when actually sort of the elite were not as openly and rapaciously corrupt and such like. Now, let's put aside as actually how accurate a representation of the Soviet Union this really was. It doesn't really matter in politics. It's all about the narrative. Well, likewise, in this way, I think they too, in their own nostalgic way, are actually mobilizing a picture of this is how Russia ought to be, and this is how it is patriotic to struggle against the Kremlin. For so long, Putin has been able to play the nationalist card. It's really quite interesting to see, having sort of made that central to his game, the way other people are trying to filch that card from the table. And that'll be interesting as a struggle we'll see, not necessarily in the run-up to the 2018 elections, though we may well see it, but mainly in years to come. Who has the best model for Russia? And I think increasingly people will say, Putin, it ain't. Thanks very much for your time.